Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Thunderball from 1965. And this is starting off my series leading up to the release of Spectre, which is Daniel Craig's fourth James Bond film. I thought I'd review all the other people who've played James Bond who've made a fourth entry. That makes sense. And I'm going in chronological Bond order, and I'm starting with the very first fourth James Bond movie with, of course, the original James Bond, Sean Connery. Thunderball is probably the first bloated James Bond, excessively expensive sequel movie. I'm not going to act like the other James Bond movies aren't bloated, but I think the thing with Thunderball is Thunderball comes along at the time when the series is probably at its most popular ever, although right now is part of that also. Thunderball was a massive hit. Adjusted for inflation, worldwide it made over $900 million, and probably in terms of admissions was the James Bond movie more people saw than any of them, which sucks because it's not probably one of the better ones, but it was ridiculously popular. In fact, when Sean Connery was making this film, he kept getting harassed by reporters. It was the biggest thing in the world. Broccoli and Saltzman put a lot more money into this. Apparently it cost more than the previous three combined, and it really feels like an excessively expensive big budget movie sequel. And the James Bond franchise has a lot of those. In fact, most of them have excessive budgets and excessive run times. But Thunderball was really the first, and it was really the first one to have a gimmick. When I think of the previous three James Bond films, Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger, I think about how they're among big budget Hollywood's greatest movies. They're some of the greatest James Bond films, not just because they're the first three. They're all very, very good. And even though this brings back the director of the first two, Terrence Young, it's still probably the first James Bond movie with a gimmick. All long-running franchises have a lot of movies with gimmicks in them, and Thunderball is the one with lots of underwater photography. Gimmicks can sometimes work for you, and certainly they've taken gimmicks that were big at the time and made them into something interesting, or trends at the time and made them into interesting Bond movies. But Thunderball doesn't really have that. It shows the excessive problems with the James Bond series rather than the excessive good that the James Bond films could do with other entries. It shows how those excessive gimmicks can be great as gimmicks and to get you in, and especially at the time, but then can age and become flaws and highlight its big budget excessiveness. Spectre has taken two nuclear missiles and hidden them, and James Bond has to get them back. After a beginning sequence in France, he goes to the Bahamas to find the eye patch big bad of this James Bond film called Largo. Has hidden these two nuclear missiles, and he's trying to hopefully find them because they're holding America and the UK and many of the world powers at ransom, and they have to bring $100 million in diamonds to hopefully stop them from using these nuclear missiles. And James Bond has gone to the Bahamas and to find Largo and hopefully find these missiles and stop Spectre from getting $100 million ransom. James Bond goes to the Bahamas and goes through many women to hopefully stop and get these missiles back from Spectre. Thunderball is often criticized for the underwater photography in this film. A lot of people feel like it gets tedious. Pauline Kael, in fact, said there's too much underwater ballet, and I have watched this film several times, and one of the more recent times I really hated it because of the underwater photography. But the more recent time, or the time before I shot this review, while I was watching it, I kept thinking like, well, you kind of have to go with it. That's the thing with the underwater photography in this. Early on, I'm like, okay, it does look really good for the time. I don't know if it holds up as well. A lot of people act like it does, but there's a certain part towards the end where Spectre's group and MI6 are fighting each other, and they have orange jumpsuits and the Spectre people have black wetsuits, and they're fighting, and you can easily tell who's good and who's bad. And that's smart, at least, that they came up with two different colors, but it's not cut very well. The action sequences aren't great. They're good for the time, and I'm really not someone who really sides with that. That's something I really hate when people say usually, but I have to admit it's not great. And there's a bunch of fighting sequences in this, particularly at the beginning where James Bond's fighting who he thinks is a widow, but it's really this guy in a dress and they're fighting. That action sequence, it's cut in a fun 60s way, but it does look really all over the place. And it's not me, someone who watches a lot of modern cinema, looking at that and going like, oh, it's not like action sequences are today. Certainly it wasn't going to be. It feels off. It feels strange. This film is weird because it comes after Goldfinger, and Goldfinger sets the standard for James Bond movies. It really sets up the structure that so many James Bond films use for the rest of the run, even up to Skyfall uses kind of the Goldfinger structure. And even though these are all written by Richard Mabum, who does a good job with all the James Bond screenplays for the most part, this one feels more like it's in a post-Goldfinger world than in the first two much better Terrence Young films like Dr. No and From Russia with Love. Now, it hasn't gone off the deep end, and there's certainly way worse James Bond movies than this one, and way more excessive ones than this one, but I think the fact that not only do you have a really excessive movie in itself and all this underwater photography that looked like it probably took forever to shoot, both Terrence Young and Sean Connery weren't really as into this. Terrence Young felt like there was no way this was really going to work. He didn't feel like it was his best work. Connery wasn't really as into it as he had been. He really didn't have anything to prove anymore. He was this huge superstar and he was getting harassed by reporters, and he really didn't like doing interviews. He only did one with Playboy. He even didn't do a television special for the James Bond films to promote Thunderball. He wasn't really as into it, and it shows in his performance. I think of the first four, this is the worst performance he had done thus far. And the first three, it feels like he's into it. He's even bringing like a lot of great movie star charm, and you get why he's still considered the best Bond. In this, it feels like he's good and he's decent at it, but he's kind of going through the motions for the most part. And that's kind of how Terrence Young feels. It's like everybody knows how to do it, and just them knowing how to do it is a great thing to watch, but it's just not as fun as watching the first three, where everyone's really got something to prove, where they're hungry, where they're having fun with it, where they're enjoying it. It isn't just that they're not as into it and as in love with doing these movies, it's just that they don't really understand like what once made them work. It's relying on the fact that, oh, we have to come up with these villains who do this certain thing now. You know, in Goldfinger, it has all these gimmicks and like Odd Job and the gold stuff, and that's cool and it works really well for Goldfinger. But it's almost like they learned the wrong lessons from that movie. They shouldn't have gone, oh, well, this is a different one. Where else can we take it? They're like, well, let's do that, but even more. A lot of people said with fourth James Bond films, it's like whoever's Bond at that point isn't as into it. The direction's never as great. It's like everybody's just kind of going through the motions because they're kind of self-assured that like, yeah, I've done this a bunch of times. I know this is going to do well. And it's kind of sad because this is such a great franchise, but there aren't as many great ones as I'd certainly like. And Thunderball has a lot of fun with it and has some great sequences, particularly where James Bond's dancing with that beautiful redhead woman and he turns around and he knows he's going to get shot and she gets shot instead. That's a great sequence, although a little sexist and horrible, but it's still a great sequence. And there's a lot of great sequences in this, actually, again with the redhead girl where she blows up that car when she's on a motorcycle with like machine guns and rocket launchers and stuff. And there's a lot of great sequences that even work today in Thunderball. It's not just like something you can completely throw under the rug, and it's not something I would throw completely under the rug. I think it just shows the weaknesses in this franchise, and it's the first film to really show you the kind of sequel we see a lot in this franchise, which is people going like, hey, look, we gave you the things you want from a James Bond movie. That's a luxury that thankfully the first three films didn't have. And as soon as people go, well, James Bond film has to have this, that, and this, that's kind of the biggest problem with people viewing the franchise and the franchise in itself, because it always has to have a scene with Q and the gadgets. It always has to have him sleeping with all these girls. It always has to have a thing that differentiates itself from the previous film. And with the underwater stuff, if John Barry didn't have such a great score, I don't think they would work as well. After a while, you're like, okay, how much of this are we gonna have in it? And I can kind of understand why people considered it tedious, why people complained about it. But I think it's showing these films kind of going like, well, we need to have a gimmick. This is what they expect. They expect a different thing each time. They also expect us to be relatively the same. That's kind of how James Bond films work, is people want it to be different, but not like too different. Don't go crazy. If you go too far, people will be like, whoa, this is not right, I don't like it. But Thunderball gives you a classic kind of James Bond of a sequel. It's just kind of like the first going through the motions James Bond sequel. The other thing about Thunderball, which is the legal drama that happened because of Thunderball, when Ian Fleming was trying to make James Bond into movies earlier, he wrote a screenplay with Kevin McClory and Jack Whittingham. That film didn't get produced, but he used that screenplay or parts of it or something and wrote the book Thunderball. And then they sued Ian Fleming, and then he made Thunderball into this movie. So it was like first a screenplay, then a book, and then this movie. And then they sued again, and there was legal drama about Thunderball until 2006. It's the only James Bond film to be remade in Never Say Never Again with Connery again. He made Thunderball twice, despite the fact that he didn't like making it the first time, but whatever. If you're gonna do any of the first couple, this is probably the one that needed improving, so it makes sense. It was some legal drama that went on for quite a while. In fact, Kevin McClory gets producer credit through legal crap. He didn't really produce it. Broccoli and Salzman did, and they get credited as executive producers. The legal drama with this would go on for a while, and I think has a lot to do with why Spectre, who is featured in this film, were not featured in James Bond films for a while, and that legal drama was settled, and now we have a film literally called Spectre. That's kind of why it's a big deal that it's finally back, because the stupid legal drama, it did have a lot of permutations throughout the rest of the James Bond franchise. Tom Jones did do the theme song. Apparently, like, they recorded one with Shirley Bassey and Dionne Warwick, I believe, but they also, there was a rejected Thunderball song by Johnny Cash, which you can hear on YouTube. I'll put a link in the description, and it's really good, and it's much better than Tom Jones's song. There's a lot of things I like about Thunderball. The women are, of course, gorgeous. I like Connery somewhat, but it does feel like there's a point where, you know, as I've heard interviews with people who've played Bond, that there's certain ones that stick out to them and they think are really good, and then there's some where it's like just another day at the office and they just don't have the passion, and clearly they're not as hungry for it, and they don't have something to prove, and this seems to be Connery's tipping point. Although he gave 3 great Bond films, and that's more than Roger Moore did. Not only 3 great Bond films, but there's 3 of the greatest big budget films of the 60s. They're incredible films. Thunderball just feels like a assembly line sequel to that with underwater crap, and I kind of wish it could have been something more. It's always been disappointing for me because I like Terrence Young's direction so much in those other films. You know, a lot of the James Bond stuff, we don't really talk about directors as much, and it wasn't until recently with the Craig films that they've gotten someone like Sam Mendes that people have paid attention to the directors. But if you're going to pay attention to any other director in James Bond franchise history, Terrence Young is the person. Even him bringing his assembly line sequel to the James Bond franchise, for me, I watched these all in order, and I've always been kind of let down with this film. I'll always revisit the first 3. Thunderball, I probably would only revisit because I'm doing something like this, or if I'm watching it in a marathon. It's kind of just there. It's like the movie you buy because it's in the box set, but you'd never buy on its own. It's always just felt like yet another Bond film. It's like, oh, that's the one where they went underwater and stuff. Now, that kind of would happen with a lot of the Bond franchise. When they'd have a really great Bond film, the next one would not be as great. But the fact that they had 3 really great films, I kind of thought it would go on for longer, but oh well. As a kind of an average Bond film, yeah, sure, it is really good. And if Terrence Young, this is his worst Bond film, there are certain directors whose best Bond film isn't as good as Thunderball. Terrence Young probably should be up there as maybe, if not the greatest Bond director. There's no way you can talk about great Bond directors and not even talk. You have to talk about Terrence Young. He is a great Bond director. If he did Dr. No and From Russia with Love, this conversation is over. Thunderball is in line with kind of your standard issue kind of Bond movie. It might be a little bit better of one, sort of, but for the most part, it's just kind of a standard Bond film, and both Connery and the director make it very much feel like a standard Bond film. It's nothing too special except for the underwater stuff, which is really the only thing that's special about it, and that's not really going to save this movie or make you want to watch it again, is it falls under the trappings of what some would say would makes this franchise special, but it also shows the trappings of that and what makes this franchise kind of stale after a while. So if you have seen Thunderball and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And my next Bond review will be Roger Moore's 4th Bond film, which is Moonraker. That'll potentially be my next review. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.